So, what do rights of nature mean to you?
Well, the rights of nature for me is an old idea whose time has come again. The rights of nature is a cry from the earth. What we have been doing isn't working. We have basically built a model of relationship with nature that says nature is a resource for our pleasure, productivity, and profit. And it's destroying nature and in turn destroying us, of course, because we're part of nature. It's also a very clear statement that the laws that we have in most countries are not only inadequate, they're kind of wrong. They come at the whole notion as a kind of a negotiation on how much pollution to go into that river, or how many trees can you take down, or how many species can you sacrifice. And so it becomes a negotiation, whereas from the rights of nature, you're saying, no, you start in a different place. You start in the place that we need to understand that this is where life comes from. And we have to do everything in our power to be part of the protection of that. And I also see the rights of nature as the antidote to the privatization, commodification, and financialization of nature, which is basically putting a price on nature, bringing it into the market where it can have to compete in order to survive. And I think we're losing many years of important work that we have to do in following that model. So the rights of nature comes from the ground, it comes from the earth, it comes from communities, it comes from indigenous people, and it's basically saying we cannot wait any longer for somebody to do something. We're going to do it ourselves.
I think rights of nature represent this really important and intrinsic movement that recognize the intrinsic rights that ecosystems and species have that I think I feel personally and recognize and really honor personally. And so seeing it increase in momentum and uptake globally, especially when it's led by Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples around the world, I think is really potent and powerful and really represents this new way of honoring life around the world, and not just life, but also ecosystems and things that the Western world doesn't typically prescribe value to or worth. I'm thinking rocks and water and all of these things that may have been commodified, but I think it really represents this way of uplifting the natural world and attributing the true honor and worth that it deserves.
So I believe that rights of nature is bringing the anthropocentric worldview to an ecocentric worldview. So by the way that we have gone forward with giving rights to people and to corporation, to me it means moving towards equity with the planet and all living things. And I think rights in nature, the way I'm beginning to understand it, and it's a right, but it's a responsibility as well. Some of what's emerging internationally through the sustainable development lens, they are starting to use, instead of a Venn diagram, they're using a concentric circles where nature is the main circle, and then you have people, basically, and then you have economy within.
And what do you think is the key to bridging academic and advocacy communities together to try to advance the rights of nature?
It's absolutely crucial to bring academics, researchers, lawyers, and so on who have the expertise with the activist groups on the ground. I'm not saying they don't have expertise, but not necessarily the same kind. Because most of the rights of nature projects are coming from communities, again, often indigenous communities. And we need to put these together. But if you don't bring them together, they're almost working at cross purposes. So we need the expertise to help guide us through this, but we need the activists on the ground because they're the ones who are living in those communities. They're the ones who will fight and go out on the rivers and stand in the forests and put their bodies there to say this must not happen. So I see this happening, and I'm really pleased at that model that we're building here in Canada very much is incorporating a model that brings together the expertise and the activism and the nonprofit groups together.
I think a great way to bring academic and advocacy groups together is really identifying not only shared values, but shared strengths. And I think people can really collaborate and work together to elevate their skill sets and identify, this academic might have legal expertise or know the colonial law system. And this advocacy group may work on the ground and with communities and can really speak to the inherent worth of the river that's in their local watershed. And so I think there's a real power in bringing two groups together, and then you can uplift each other's skills through collaboration from that.
I would say it's not only the advocacy community, but the people who want to engage on this. So, I've been talking to people, particularly in Latin American countries, and when you have the conversations with Spanish-speaking people, there's a whole different approach to the way of being with nature. Maybe part of what we have to do is bring in that spiritual side and have that understanding of that connection and the idea of animism in all living things. Everything is alive. So to bridge that divide between academic and non-academic, I think it's having conversations and having people who can both help influence the academic way of being, because it tends to sometimes be very narrow and very focused and maybe not so action oriented as academics can be. And then also to have the capacity to translate complexity maybe into plain language. And I think academia could do a really good service for the rest of civil society in creating mechanisms or teachables for parliamentarians and helping for them to understand it.
For me, what's unique about the Canadian context is that it's mostly rivers so far, although Lake Winnipeg has also been targeted. But it started with the Magpie River in northern Quebec, but the Athabasca in northern Alberta, the Gatineau in Quebec, near me in Ontario as well. The Yukon has been targeted to become a legal person. There's groups working along the St. Lawrence on both the American and Canadian sides and so on. So really we've targeted water, and I think that's so important to Canada's past and our mythology and our sense that we have to care for this water because it's so precious. The other reason that I think is very Canadian, or what's unique here, is that it is almost exclusively produced by Indigenous communities who are living there, who are saying we now have our rights under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to protect our territory, to have a say in the resources in our territory, to think as a community, to think historically, to think culturally. This is a really wonderful new expansion of the concept of human rights. And I think you're going to see more and more Indigenous communities asserting their legal rights, their inherent rights, under the Rights of Nature banner. They become, as you know, the guardians. And when people sort of mock this and say, well, is a river going to go to court? You say, does a child go to court? No, a guardian goes to court for a child. But you have guardians that speak for the river, but the river has rights. And this has been a very exciting project here. My favorite is that of the rights that the Magpie River has been given, it has the right to sue, which I think is quite wonderful.
I think we are so young and new in the game. If I look at Australia, which has a similar parliamentary system, they've been speaking about it for longer. And so unique to Canada is trying to have these conversations where people will listen to you even right now, because there's so many competing interests.
I think in Canada, we're really well positioned to really celebrate and uplift Indigenous-led rights of nature movements and case studies. And I know that has happened around the world, and we've followed and learned a lot from other Indigenous-led rights of nature work. And so I think Indigenous communities across Canada and Turtle Island really, I think, need to be empowered. And as they reclaim their culture and their language and their rights and title, how I think Canada and especially settlers can identify how we can support Indigenous communities in doing that. And of course, there's going to be a wide range of how rights of nature are viewed by communities and cultures, but I think really identifying how in Canada we can uplift Indigenous folks in leading that work. So I see that as a real unique position that Canada is in.